remember the exact moment my life shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, one of those days when autumn had just begun to paint the leaves with strokes of amber and crimson. I had dragged myself through the front door of our modest two-story house on Maple Street, exhausted from another grueling day at the accounting firm where I worked as a senior analyst. My feet ached, my shoulders were tense from hours hunched over spreadsheets, and all I wanted was to collapse on the couch with a cup of tea and maybe watch something mindless on television. But the house was silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence that comes when everyone is peacefully occupied in their own spaces, but the heavy, suffocating kind that presses against your chest and makes your heart race with inexplicable dread. I called out for David, my husband of 7 years, but received no answer. I called for Vivian, my younger sister who had been staying with us for the past 6 months while she sorted out her life as a single mother. Still nothing. The air felt thick as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. That was when I saw him. Little Ethan, my 5-year-old nephew, was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, his small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. His dark hair was disheveled, his Superman pajamas wrinkled, and his eyes were red and swollen from crying. In his tiny hands, he clutched a white envelope, holding it as if it were a lifeline in a turbulent sea. The sight of him like that made my stomach drop. I rushed to him, dropping my purse and briefcase on the floor with a clatter that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. I knelt before him, my hands reaching out to touch his tear-stained cheeks. "Ethan, sweetie, what's wrong? Where's your mom? Where's Uncle David?" The questions tumbled out of me in a panicked rush, but Ethan just stared at me with those huge, bewildered eyes and wordlessly handed me the envelope. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter written in Vivian's distinctive, looping handwriting. As I read the first few lines, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Dear Eleanor," the letter began, and I knew immediately that whatever followed would be devastating. "By the time you read this, David and I will be gone. We've been in love for over a year now, and we can't keep living this lie anymore. We're starting a new life together somewhere far from here, where we can finally be happy." I had to read those words 3 times before they began to sink in. David, my husband, the man I had loved since college, the man who had promised to stand by me through sickness and health, had been carrying on an affair with my own sister. The sister I had taken in when she got pregnant and her boyfriend abandoned her. The sister I had supported emotionally and financially, helping her raise Ethan while she supposedly looked for work and tried to get back on her feet. But that wasn't even the worst part. As I continued reading, my vision blurred with tears and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. About Ethan, the letter went on. "The doctors have diagnosed him with a terminal illness. They say he only has a few months left, maybe less. I can't bear to watch him suffer, Eleanor. I just can't do it. So I'm leaving him in your care. I know you're strong enough to handle this. There are legal documents on the kitchen table transferring guardianship to you. Everything is signed and notarized. Take care of him in his final days. I'm sorry I can't be the mother he deserves. Vivian." The letter slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the floor. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare, and I would wake up any second now to find David beside me and Vivian in the guest room with Ethan sleeping peacefully in his little bed. But when I looked at Ethan still sitting there on that step, still trembling and confused, I knew with crushing certainty that this was real. I screamed. I screamed David's name until my throat was raw. I screamed Vivian's name until my voice cracked and broke. I tore through the house like a woman possessed, checking every room, every closet, every corner, desperate to find them and make them take back this cruel joke. But they were gone. Their belongings were gone. Their presence had been erased as if they had never existed in this house at all. Eventually, my legs gave out and I sank to the floor in the kitchen, my body racked with sobs. That was when Ethan, that sweet, innocent child, came padding into the room on his small feet. He stood beside me, his hand reaching out to pat my shoulder with the kind of awkward gentleness that children use when they don't quite understand the situation but know something is wrong. "Mommy and Uncle David went on a trip, Aunt Eleanor." He whispered, his voice small and uncertain. "They said they'd be gone for a while." Those words, spoken with such childish innocence, felt like a knife twisting in my heart. A trip. They had told this 5-year-old boy that they were going on a trip, probably while packing their bags and preparing to abandon him forever. The casual cruelty of it was staggering. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I forced myself to get up. My legs felt like rubber, but I made myself walk to the kitchen table where Vivian had said the documents would be. Sure enough, there they were, neatly stacked and waiting for me like a death sentence. Divorce papers already signed by David with highlighted tabs showing where I needed to sign. A guardianship transfer document for Ethan signed by Vivian and notarized by someone I didn't recognize. Medical records supposedly documenting Ethan's terminal diagnosis. And underneath it all, a copy of their marriage certificate dated just 2 days ago. They had gotten married. My husband and my sister had gotten married while still legally bound to me, then served me with divorce papers and left me with a dying child. The calculated cruelty of it all took my breath away. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, some passionate mistake made in the heat of emotion. This was planned, orchestrated, executed with cold precision. They had used me, both of them, until I was no longer useful. And then they had discarded me along with an innocent child, wrapping their betrayal in legal documents that turned their abandonment into something binding and official. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat on the couch with Ethan curled up beside me, his small body finally relaxed in exhausted sleep, and I stared at the wall as the hours crawled by. My mind raced through memories, piecing together all the signs I had missed. The way David had started working late more often. The times I had come home to find him and Vivian deep in conversation that would stop abruptly when I entered the room. The knowing looks they had exchanged. The way Vivian had gradually pushed Ethan into my care more and more, claiming she needed time to look for work or attend interviews that never seemed to result in job offers. I had been so blind, so stupidly trusting. I had believed that family meant something, that loyalty meant something, that the bonds of marriage and blood were sacred and unbreakable. What a fool I had been. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows, I made a decision. I looked down at Ethan, his face peaceful in sleep, his small hand clutching the edge of my shirt, and I realized something that cut through my despair like a beam of light through darkness. They had meant to burden me with a dying child as their final act of cruelty. They had wanted me to suffer, to spend my days and nights caring for a terminally ill little boy while they lived their happy new life far away. But I refused to let this child become a burden or a symbol of their betrayal. I refused to let them win. The next morning, after feeding Ethan breakfast and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the chaos swirling in my head, I called in sick to work and made an appointment with the most renowned pediatrician in the city, Dr. Evelyn Reed. I had heard about her through various connections, knew she had trained at Johns Hopkins, and had a reputation for being both brilliant and thorough. If Ethan was truly dying, I wanted to know everything to understand what we were facing. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something wasn't right about Vivian's claim. Getting the appointment required pulling strings and calling in favors, but by that afternoon I had Ethan in Dr. Reed's office. The doctor was a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and an air of competent authority that immediately put me at ease. She listened carefully as I explained the situation, her expression growing increasingly troubled as I described the letter and the supposed terminal diagnosis. "May I see the medical records?" she asked, and I handed over the documents Vivian had left. Dr. Reed studied them for a long moment, her brow furrowed. Then she looked at Ethan, who was sitting quietly in the corner, playing with blocks I had brought from home. "With your permission, I'd like to run a comprehensive examination and some tests." Over the next 4 hours, Dr. Reed put Ethan through a battery of examinations and tests. She checked his vitals, drew blood, performed scans, and throughout it all, she maintained a calm, reassuring presence that kept Ethan from becoming frightened. I sat in the waiting room, my hands twisted together in my lap, my mind cycling through worst-case scenarios and fragile hopes. Finally, Dr. Reed called me into her office. Ethan was in the next room, contentedly watching cartoons with one of the nurses. I sat down across from the doctor, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Ms. Vance." Dr. Reed began, her voice gentle but firm. "I need to be very direct with you. Ethan does not have a terminal illness. In fact, he has no serious illness at all. What he does have is severe malnutrition and signs of prolonged neglect. These medical records you were given," she tapped the papers on her desk, "are either completely fabricated or belong to a different child entirely. Ethan is a healthy 5-year-old boy who has been systematically starved and neglected." For a moment, I couldn't process what she was saying. The words seemed to bounce off my brain without finding purchase. Then suddenly, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "They starved him," I whispered, and then the whisper became a shout. "They starved him. They deliberately harmed their own child to make their abandonment seem like an act of mercy." Dr. Reed nodded gravely. "I'm afraid so. The pattern is consistent with intentional food deprivation. Based on his current state and what recovery typically looks like, I would estimate this has been going on for at least several months, possibly longer. I'm required by law to report this to Child Protective Services." "Do it," I said immediately. "Report everything. I want it all documented. I want a paper trail that shows exactly what they did to him. But I also want to know what I need to do to help him recover." "What does he need?" Dr. Reed smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of hope. "He needs proper nutrition, a stable environment, and love. Lots of love. Children are remarkably resilient, Ms. Vance. With the right care, Ethan can make a full recovery. I'll provide you with a detailed nutrition plan, and I'd like to see him weekly for the next few months to monitor his progress. I'll also put you in touch with a child psychologist because the emotional neglect is going to need addressing as well." That night, after I had gotten Ethan settled in what was now officially his room, I made a vow. I stood beside his bed, watching him sleep, his small chest rising and falling with each breath, and I spoke the words aloud to the empty room. "I will make you strong. I will make you healthy. I will make you the happiest, most loved child in the world. And they will regret ever laying hands on you. They will regret ever thinking they could throw you away like garbage." It wasn't just a promise of protection. It was a promise of vindication. It was a promise that their cruelty would not go unpunished even if that punishment took years to deliver. The following days became a careful dance of survival and determination. I took a week off work using my saved vacation time to focus entirely on Ethan. The Child Protective Services investigation moved quickly, and a caseworker named Margaret Chin became a regular presence in our lives. She was a woman in her early 40s, practical and no-nonsense, but with a warmth that made Ethan feel safe around her. Margaret documented everything. She photographed Ethan's malnourished state, his protruding ribs, the hollowness of his cheeks. She interviewed him gently, asking about his memories of living with Vivian. What Ethan revealed during those sessions made my blood run cold. He talked about being locked in his room during the day when Vivian had visitors. He mentioned going to bed hungry most nights. He described how his mother would yell at him if he asked for food, calling him greedy and ungrateful. "Ms. Vance," Margaret said to me after one particularly difficult session, "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and this is one of the most clear-cut cases of child abuse and abandonment I've encountered. The fact that they fabricated a terminal illness diagnosis to justify leaving him is particularly disturbing. It shows premeditation and a level of calculated cruelty that's rare even in my line of work." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we build a case. We document his recovery. We try to locate the biological parents for potential prosecution, and we make sure Ethan gets the care and stability he deserves. You're doing everything right, Ms. Vance, more than right. You're giving him a real chance at life." But even as I focused on Ethan's immediate needs, I couldn't stop thinking about Vivian and David. The betrayal cut deeper with each passing day as new details emerged. I discovered that David had been systematically draining our joint savings account for months, transferring small amounts that I hadn't noticed into a separate account. By the time they left, he had taken over $40,000 money. I had been saving for years with dreams of buying a bigger house or maybe starting my own business someday. I found text messages on an old phone David had left behind. Messages between him and Vivian that dated back over a year. They were explicit romantic and discussed their plans to leave in detail. One message from Vivian particularly stood out. She had written to David about a month before they left. "E is getting to be too much trouble. He cries all the time about being hungry. Maybe if he gets sick enough, it'll make our story more believable. We need Eleanor to think we're making a sacrifice by leaving him with her, not that we're just dumping our problem on her doorstep." Reading those words, seeing the cold calculation behind their actions made me physically ill. They had deliberately starved a child to create a cover story for their abandonment. What kind of monsters were they? I contacted a family lawyer that Margaret recommended, a sharp woman named Patricia Sterling, who specialized in cases involving child abandonment and custody disputes. She listened to my story with a carefully neutral expression, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Ms. Vance," she said, "when I had finished, what they did is legally abandonment and child endangerment. The fact that they documented the guardianship transfer actually works in your favor because it proves their intent to permanently relinquish care. However, I need to be honest with you. The statute of limitations for pressing certain charges is limited, and since they left the state, prosecution becomes more complicated. Building a criminal case could take years and may ultimately be unsuccessful. That said, we can document everything. We can prepare civil suits for the money they took, for emotional damages, for the costs of Ethan's care. And if they ever try to come back into this child's life, we'll have everything we need to fight them." "What about finding them?" I asked. "What about making sure they face some kind of consequences?" Mrs. Sterling tapped her pen against her notepad thoughtfully. "I know a private investigator, Frank Peterson. He's discreet, thorough, and he specializes in tracking down individuals who don't want to be found. He's expensive, but he gets results. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish by finding them?" I paused, considering the question. At that moment, I wasn't entirely sure. Part of me wanted revenge, wanted to see them suffer as I was suffering. But another part of me, the part that was growing stronger each day as I watched Ethan slowly begin to trust me, wanted something different. I want to know where they are and what they're doing. I want documentation of their new life. And someday, when Ethan is old enough to understand, I want him to know the truth. I want him to see that we survived and thrived while they— I trailed off, unable to articulate the complex mix of emotions I was feeling. "While they face the consequences of their choices," Mrs. Sterling finished for me. "I understand. I'll put you in touch with Frank." Within a week, Frank Peterson sat in my living room, a man in his early 60s with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather notebook. "I can find them," he said when I finished. "People always leave trails, especially when they're not trying very hard to hide. The question is, what do you want me to do once I find them? Just locate them or continue monitoring their activities?" "Continue monitoring," I said. "I want to know everything. Where they live, where they work, who they associate with, how they spend their money. Everything." "That's going to be expensive," he warned. "We're talking about years of surveillance and documentation." "I don't care," I said flatly. I had already started liquidating assets, selling off jewelry and collectibles that David hadn't managed to take. "I would do whatever it took." Frank nodded slowly. "All right, I'll take the case. But Ms. Vance, I need to give you some advice. This kind of long-term surveillance, this need to know everything about people who hurt you, it can become consuming. It can prevent you from moving forward with your own life. Whatever your ultimate goal is, make sure it's worth the cost, not just financially, but emotionally." His words stuck with me, but they didn't change my mind. I needed to know. I needed to understand what they were building while I picked up the pieces they had left behind. The first few months with Ethan were the hardest. Following Dr. Reed's nutritional plan, I carefully reintroduced food into his diet, being mindful not to overwhelm his system. But it wasn't just about the physical healing. The emotional scars ran deep. Ethan would hoard food in his pockets and under his mattress, convinced that meals would stop coming. He would flinch when I moved too quickly near him, as if expecting to be hit. He had nightmares almost every night, waking up screaming about being locked in dark rooms. The child psychologist Dr. Reed had recommended Dr. Sarah Martinez became another crucial support. She specialized in trauma in young children and had a gentle approach that gradually helped Ethan open up about his experiences. "Eleanor," she told me after one session, "Ethan's case is severe, but I want you to know that children are incredibly resilient. With consistent love, safety, and support, he can heal. However, the process will take time, possibly years. There will be setbacks. There will be moments when you feel like you're not making progress. But every day of stability, every moment of genuine care is building new neural pathways in his brain, teaching him that the world can be safe and that adults can be trusted. I threw myself into being the parent Ethan needed. I read every book on child development and trauma recovery I could find. I learned about attachment theory, about the importance of routine and consistency, about how to handle behavioral issues that stemmed from neglect. I became an expert on childhood nutrition, on developmental milestones, on age-appropriate activities. But maintaining my demanding job while providing the level of care Ethan needed was impossible. I was constantly requesting time off for doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, and the inevitable crises that came with caring for a traumatized child. My work performance suffered. My boss, while sympathetic at first, eventually called me into his office. "Eleanor," he said, his tone both kind and firm, "I understand you're going through a difficult time, but your billable hours have dropped significantly. You've missed important client meetings. I need to know if you're able to continue in this role, because right now I'm not seeing the commitment we need from a senior analyst." I looked at him across his massive desk, at the photos of his own children playing soccer and graduating from college, and I made a decision. I quit. I said simply, "I can't do this job and be the guardian Ethan needs. He has to come first." My boss seemed surprised, perhaps expecting me to beg for more time or make promises I couldn't keep. "Eleanor, maybe you should think about this. You're giving up a significant salary benefits your career trajectory." "I've thought about it," I replied, "and I know what I need to do." Walking out of that office felt both terrifying and liberating. I had just sacrificed a career I had built over a decade, a stable income, and professional identity. But as I drove home to Ethan, who was with a babysitter I trusted, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was making the right choice. The question now was how to support us financially. My savings, depleted by medical bills and legal fees, wouldn't last long. I needed something flexible, something I could do from home while still being available for Ethan. That's when I remembered my grandmother's recipe for buttercream frosting, the one that had been the star of every family celebration when I was growing up. I started small, making custom cakes for friends and neighbors. Word spread quickly about the woman on Maple Street who made beautiful, delicious cakes. Within a few months, I had more orders than I could handle. I converted our garage into a licensed commercial kitchen, invested in professional equipment, and officially launched Eleanor's Custom Cakes. The business grew faster than I expected. I specialized in elaborate celebration cakes, wedding cakes, and custom designs. My attention to detail, combined with genuine talent for decorating and flavor combinations, attracted clients from across the city. Within a year, I was earning almost as much as I had at the accounting firm, but with the flexibility to set my own hours and be present for Ethan. Our neighbor, Mr. Joe, became an unexpected ally during this time. He was a widower in his 70s who had lived on Maple Street for 40 years. His own children had moved across the country and rarely visited, a fact that clearly pained him. He started coming over in the afternoons initially to bring us vegetables from his garden, but gradually becoming a regular presence in our lives. One day, about 6 months after Vivian and David left, Mr. Joe knocked on my door with his usual offering of tomatoes. As I invited him in for coffee, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something I should have told you months ago." He looked uncomfortable, his weathered hands gripping his coffee mug tightly. "I saw them, your sister and your husband. For months before they left, I'd see them together when you were at work. In the backyard, in the car, sometimes through the windows. It was clear they were more than family. I thought about telling you, but I didn't want to interfere in your business. Then when they left and I learned what they'd done to that boy, I've been carrying this guilt ever since." "Mr. Joe," I said gently, "even if you had told me, I'm not sure I would have believed you. I was blind to what was happening. That's not your fault." "Still," he said, "if I had spoken up, maybe things would have been different. Or maybe they would have been worse," I replied. "Maybe they would have found a way to leave sooner, and Ethan's condition would have been even more severe. We can't know. What matters is what we do from here." From that day forward, Mr. Joe appointed himself as our unofficial grandfather figure. He taught Ethan how to play chess, how to tend a garden, how to fix simple things around the house. He watched Ethan for short periods when I had cake deliveries or consultations with clients. More importantly, he provided a stable, kind male presence in Ethan's life at a time when the boy's trust in men had been shattered by David's betrayal. Meanwhile, Frank Peterson's reports started arriving. The first one came about 3 months after I hired him, delivered in a plain manila envelope. Inside were photos, documents, and a typed summary. David and Vivian had settled in a suburb outside of San Diego called La Jolla, an expensive coastal community. David had secured a position at a tech company, apparently using connections from his previous job. They were renting a luxury apartment with ocean views. The photos showed them looking happy and carefree. There was one of them having dinner at an upscale restaurant, both dressed elegantly, holding hands across the table. Another showed them at a beach, Vivian in a bikini, David with his arm around her waist, both laughing at something off camera. They looked like a couple in love without a care in the world. I stared at those photos for hours, feeling a complex mixture of rage, pain, and bitter determination. While I was struggling to help a traumatized child heal, while I was sacrificing my career and my savings, while I was staying up nights researching trauma therapy and childhood nutrition, they were living a life of luxury and pleasure. They had gotten exactly what they wanted at no cost to themselves, or so they thought. But Frank's report also included more interesting details. Financial records obtained through various legal means showed that they were spending beyond their means. Credit card debt was accumulating. There were regular charges to expensive restaurants, designer boutiques, and luxury goods. David's salary, while substantial, wasn't enough to support the lifestyle they were trying to maintain. I filed this information away, sensing that their perfect life might not be as stable as it appeared. As the months turned into the first year, Ethan began to transform. With proper nutrition, his body filled out. Color returned to his cheeks. His hair grew thicker and healthier. But more importantly, his personality began to emerge. He was bright, curious, and had an infectious laugh when he felt safe enough to let it out. He asked endless questions about how things worked, why the sky was blue, where babies came from, how cakes rose in the oven. I enrolled him in kindergarten at the local public school meeting with his teacher to explain his background without going into traumatic detail. Mrs. Patterson was a veteran teacher in her 50s who had seen everything. She promised to watch for signs of difficulty and to contact me immediately if concerns arose. The first few weeks of school were rough. Ethan had trouble socializing with other children, his lack of early childhood socialization making him awkward in group settings. He hoarded snacks from the classroom. He had a meltdown when another child accidentally knocked over his building blocks. But Mrs. Patterson was patient and skilled, and gradually Ethan began to find his footing. His first real friend was a boy named Marcus, whose parents were a same-sex couple that had adopted him from foster care. Marcus had his own trauma background, and somehow the two boys recognized something in each other. They became inseparable, and Marcus's parents, Tom and James, became allies in Ethan's healing journey. One afternoon, about 18 months after Vivian and David left, I was frosting a 3-tier wedding cake when Ethan came into the kitchen after school. He watched me work for a few minutes, then said quietly, "Can I call you Mom?" I nearly dropped my piping bag. The question had come out of nowhere, or so I thought. I set down my tools and knelt to his level. "What brought this up, sweetie?" He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. Marcus was asking about my family, about my parents. I didn't know what to tell him. Vivian left me, and I don't remember my dad. He was gone before I was born. But you're here. You take care of me. You make me lunch and help with homework and come to my school. You're like a mom. Can I call you that? My eyes filled with tears. Oh, Ethan, you can call me whatever feels right to you. I would be honored to be your mom. He looked up at me, then his dark eyes serious. Even though Vivian might come back someday. If Vivian ever comes back, I said firmly, and I doubt she will, nothing changes. I'm your mom now in every way that matters. She gave birth to you, but I'm raising you. I'm the one who loves you. That makes me your mom. Okay, he said, and then testing out the word, Mom. Yes, baby. Can I have a snack? I laughed, ruffling his hair. Of course you can. There are apple slices in the fridge. From that day forward, I was Mom, and he was my son. The transformation in our relationship was subtle but profound. He began to trust more deeply, to believe that I wouldn't leave him, to understand that love could be permanent and unconditional. Dr. Martinez noted the change in our therapy sessions. "This is a major milestone, Eleanor," He's transferring his attachment from a mother figure who failed him to one who is proving reliable. This is exactly what we want to see, but I want to warn you there may still be setbacks. Trauma doesn't heal in a straight line. She was right. That summer, Ethan overheard me on the phone with Mrs. Sterling discussing some legal matter related to the guardianship. He must have misunderstood part of the conversation because later that evening he had a complete breakdown sobbing that I was going to send him away, that he knew he was too much trouble, that he would try to be better. It took hours to calm him down, to reassure him that I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. We spent the night curled up on the couch together, watching his favorite movies and talking about permanence and commitment. "I'm not leaving you," I told him over and over. "You're my son. I chose you, and I will keep choosing you every single day for the rest of our lives." Meanwhile, Frank's reports continued to arrive every few months documenting David and Vivian's life on the West Coast. About a year and a half after they left, Frank's report included a significant development. Vivian was pregnant. The news hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the surveillance photo showing Vivian with a visible baby bump, looking radiant in a maternity dress, David's hand resting possessively on her stomach. They were having a baby together. They were starting the family they had always wanted while they had thrown away the child that already existed. I showed the photo to Mrs. Sterling during our next meeting. "Does this change anything legally?" I asked. She studied the image carefully. "Potentially. It demonstrates their capacity to parent when they choose to, which could be relevant if we ever go to court regarding Ethan. It shows abandonment was a choice, not an inability. But, Eleanor, I need to ask, what are you building toward with all this documentation? What's your end goal?" "I want them to face consequences," I said. "I want Ethan to know the truth when he's old enough, and I want to be prepared if they ever try to come back into his life." Mrs. Sterling nodded. "Those are all reasonable goals, but I'm going to give you the same advice Frank probably has. Don't let this consume you. Don't let your need for eventual justice prevent you from living your life now. You're doing an amazing job with Ethan. Focus on that. The rest will come in time." Her words were wise, but I couldn't let go of my need to know, to document, to prepare. I paid Frank's monthly retainer, religiously reading each report the day it arrived. I learned that David and Vivian had gotten married in a small ceremony in Nevada shortly after leaving, making their relationship legal, even though David's divorce from me wasn't finalized for months afterward. I learned that they told friends and colleagues a completely fabricated story about their relationship, claiming they had met after David's marriage to me ended, erasing the reality of their affair and betrayal. When Vivian gave birth to a daughter they named Summer, the photos Frank sent showed a perfect little family. David holding the newborn with pride, Vivian glowing with maternal happiness, grandparents visiting from out of state, a nursery decorated in soft pinks and creams. It was the picture of domestic bliss built on a foundation of cruelty and lies. I filed the photos away with all the others, the evidence growing into a substantial archive. But I also made sure not to let it consume me, as both Frank and Mrs. Sterling had warned. I focused on Ethan, on my business, on building a life that was stable and fulfilling despite the circumstances of how it began. Ethan thrived in elementary school. He excelled academically, particularly in science and math. His teacher in second grade, Mr. Chin, recognized his potential and started giving him more advanced work. By third grade, Ethan was reading at a middle school level and doing math problems that challenged fifth graders. But what pleased me most was seeing his social development. He had a solid group of friends. He joined the school science club. He played soccer in a recreational league. On his 10th birthday, I threw him a big party at our house, inviting his entire class. The backyard was decorated with superhero themes. There was a magician for entertainment, and I had made an elaborate 3-tier cake shaped like a rocket ship. Watching Ethan laugh and play with his friends, his face flushed with happiness as he opened presents and ate cake, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This child who had been starved and neglected, who had been deemed too much trouble by his biological parents, was now thriving in ways I couldn't have imagined in those dark early days. Mr. Joe, who had become a fixture at every milestone, pulled me aside during the party. "You've done something remarkable here, Eleanor. That boy is happy, healthy, and loved. Whatever sacrifices you made, they were worth it." I looked at Ethan, surrounded by friends, his smile genuine and bright. "You're right," I said. "He was worth every sacrifice." But even as we built our happy life, Frank's reports continued to paint a different picture on the West Coast. Financial troubles were becoming more apparent in David and Vivian's life. Credit card debt was mounting. There were records of David taking out loans. Their lifestyle hadn't changed. They were still spending as if money was endless, but the reality was catching up with them. Frank noted in one report that they had missed several payments on their luxury apartment, and there were indications they might be facing eviction. More interesting were the personal details Frank uncovered. He had developed sources, people who knew David and Vivian socially, who could provide insights beyond what surveillance photos showed. One source reported that the couple fought frequently, often about money. Another mentioned that Vivian seemed unhappy despite having the life she had apparently wanted. There were hints that David was traveling frequently for work, perhaps more frequently than his job required. The perfect facade was developing cracks. As Ethan entered middle school, I began to consider when and how to tell him the full truth about his past. He knew the basics, that his biological mother had left him with me, and that I had adopted him legally after the required waiting period. But he didn't know about the fabricated terminal illness, about the deliberate starvation, about the calculated cruelty of it all. Dr. Martinez and I discussed the timing extensively. "There's no perfect age to learn something like this," she explained. But Ethan is emotionally mature for his age. He has a strong support system. He knows he's loved. If you're going to tell him early adolescence might actually be ideal. He's old enough to understand the complexity, but young enough that you'll still be his primary source of interpretation and support. So on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when Ethan was 12, I sat him down and told him everything. I showed him the original letter from Vivian, which I had kept in my safe. I showed him Dr. Reed's medical reports documenting his condition when I first brought him in. I showed him some of Frank's reports edited to remove the most invasive details, showing where Vivian and David were and what their life looked like. Ethan listened in silence, his face growing paler as the story unfolded. When I finished, he sat quietly for a long time processing everything. Then he said something that surprised me. "I remember some of it. I remember being hungry all the time. I remember Vivian telling me I was being greedy when I asked for food. I remember strange men coming over and her locking me in my room. I thought maybe I had imagined it, that maybe my memory was wrong because it seemed so awful. But it was real." "It was real," I confirmed gently. "What they did was wrong, unforgivably wrong. But you survived. You're here. You're healthy. You're loved. They failed you, but you didn't fail." "Are we going to do something about it?" he asked. "Are we going to make them pay?" The question was direct and mature beyond his years. "Do you want them to pay?" He thought about it seriously. "I think they should know that I'm okay, that they didn't break me, that the thing they threw away became something good." "Is that weird?" "Not at all," I assured him. "And yes, someday they will know. I promise you that." From that conversation forward, there was a new understanding between us. Ethan knew the full truth of his past, and rather than destroying him, it seemed to steel his resolve to become something more. He started talking about becoming a doctor, specifically a pediatrician. "I want to help kids who are going through what I went through," he explained. "I want to make sure no child falls through the cracks." His dedication to this goal was remarkable. He threw himself into his studies with even more intensity. He volunteered at the local children's hospital. He read medical journals that most adults would find impenetrable. By the time he entered high school, he was taking advanced placement classes in biology and chemistry, already building the foundation for a pre-med track in college. During these years, Frank's reports showed David and Vivian's life continuing its slow unraveling. They had moved from the expensive La Jolla apartment to a more modest townhouse in a less prestigious neighborhood. David had changed jobs twice, each time lateral moves that suggested he was struggling professionally. Vivian wasn't working, staying home with Summer, but the financial strain was evident. They had sold the luxury cars and downgraded to practical sedans. The designer clothes and expensive dinners became less frequent. But more interesting were the indications of personal discord. Frank's sources reported that the couple was in marriage counseling. There were sightings of David at bars late at night alone. Credit card statements showed hotel charges in Las Vegas, trips that David appeared to take by himself. The passionate love affair that had led them to destroy 2 families was souring into resentment and regret. When Ethan was 16, I received a report from Frank that made me pause. Summer, now approaching her teenage years, was having difficulties. She had been suspended from her expensive private school for behavioral issues. There were indications of substance experimentation of associating with a problematic peer group. The perfect child that David and Vivian had chosen to raise while abandoning Ethan was showing signs of serious trouble. I showed the report to Ethan, who was now mature enough to handle these updates. He read it carefully, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know what's sad," he said. "Summer never did anything wrong. She was just born into their dysfunction. I actually feel sorry for her." His compassion, his ability to see beyond his own trauma, to empathize with a half-sister he had never met, made me incredibly proud. "That's very mature of you," I said. "We're products of how we're raised, right?" he replied. "You raised me with love and stability. They're raising her with whatever mess they've become. Of course the outcomes are different." Ethan graduated high school as valedictorian with early acceptance to a prestigious university and a full scholarship. His valedictory speech talked about overcoming adversity, about the importance of the adults who show up for children, about how love and commitment matter more than biology. I sat in the audience with Mr. Joe beside me, both of us crying proud tears as Ethan spoke with confidence and eloquence about finding strength in hardship. At university, Ethan flourished. He excelled in his pre-med courses, joined medical volunteer organizations, and became a peer counselor for students dealing with trauma. He called me several times a week, updating me on his classes, his research opportunities, his growing certainty that pediatrics was his calling. During his sophomore year of college, he met Anna, a sweet and intelligent young woman studying elementary education. They bonded over their shared passion for helping children, and I watched their relationship develop with happiness. Anna came from a stable, loving family, and she was unintimidated by Ethan's past. In fact, she told me during a visit his resilience and compassion made her love him more. Meanwhile, Frank's reports showed David and Vivian's situation continuing to deteriorate. They had separated briefly, then reconciled. David had lost another job and was working in a position significantly below his qualifications. Vivian had finally gotten a job working retail at a department store. Summer had dropped out of high school and was living at home, apparently directionless. The life they had built on betrayal and cruelty was collapsing slowly but inexorably. And while I took no pleasure in anyone's suffering, I couldn't deny a sense of vindication. The perfect life they had chased by destroying ours was revealed as hollow and unsustainable. Ethan was 20, home for spring break from medical school, his first year nearly complete. He had grown into a remarkable young man, tall and confident, with an air of competent authority that spoke to his future career. We decided to attend a charity gala for children's hospitals being held at a prestigious hotel downtown. It was an event I had donated cakes to for several years, and Ethan wanted to show support for the cause that aligned with his career goals. Neither of us expected to encounter the past that evening, but fate, it seemed, had a sense of timing. We were examining the silent auction items Ethan in a tailored suit that made him look every inch the young professional he was becoming when I heard a laugh that made my entire body go rigid. It was artificial and high-pitched, the kind of laugh people use at social events to project an image of sophistication. I would have known that laugh anywhere. I turned slowly, and there they were. Vivian and David, dressed in clothes that were nice but not quite expensive enough for this crowd, standing near the bar with drinks in their hands. They had aged 15 years, showing in the lines on their faces and the thickness in their middles. David's hairline had receded, and Vivian's face had a hardness it hadn't possessed before. Between them stood a teenage girl who had to be Summer, looking uncomfortable in a dress that didn't quite fit her body language, suggesting she didn't want to be there. "Mom," Ethan had noticed my reaction, his hand on my arm. "What's wrong?" I couldn't speak. 15 years of carefully controlled anger suddenly rose up like a tidal wave. They hadn't seen us yet, were laughing with another couple, completely unaware that their past was about to crash into their present. Before I could decide what to do, Vivian's gaze swept across the room and landed on me. I watched recognition slowly dawn, watched her expression shift from confusion to shock to something that might have been fear. She grabbed David's arm urgently, and he turned to look. The color drained from his face. For a long moment, we all just stared at each other across the crowded gala, separated by 15 feet and 15 years of anger and hurt. Then, Vivian's face twisted into something ugly, and she started walking toward us, David trailing reluctantly behind her, Summer following with obvious confusion. "Well, well," Vivian said as she got closer, her voice dripping with false sweetness and barely concealed malice. "Eleanor, I never expected to see you here. This doesn't really seem like your kind of event, still living in that little house on Maple Street." "Actually, I live in a larger house now," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the rage boiling inside me. The baking business did quite well. I was able to expand. "How nice," Vivian said dismissively. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, and I saw confusion cross her face. She didn't recognize her own son. "I suppose you finally found yourself a man. Took long enough." David was staring at Ethan with a strange expression, something between confusion and dawning recognition. There was something familiar in the young man's features, something that was nagging at the edges of his memory. Before I could respond, Vivian continued her words, becoming crueler. "I'm surprised you're still in town, actually. I thought you might have moved away after everything. But I suppose you couldn't afford to. Tell me, are you still bitter about what happened? It was so long ago, Eleanor. You really should have moved on by now." "Moved on," I repeated softly. "From what exactly, Vivian? From having my husband and my sister betray me in the most intimate way possible? From being abandoned with a child you claimed was dying?" "Oh, please." Vivian waved her hand dismissively. "That kid probably died years ago anyway. You should be thanking us for giving you a purpose for a few months. And honestly, David and I did you a favor. You were always so boring, Eleanor. So plain and predictable. David needed someone with more fire, more passion." I felt Ethan tense beside me, but I put a hand on his arm, a silent signal to wait. This was my moment. Summer had wandered closer, drawn by the obvious tension. She looked between the adults with undisguised curiosity. "Mom, who are these people?" she asked in a voice that suggested she found the whole situation beneath her notice. "Just some old acquaintances, sweetheart," Vivian said, not taking her eyes off me. "Nobody important." "Actually," I said, my voice gaining strength, "Vivian. David, I think you should meet someone. This is Ethan, though I suppose you might remember him by another name. Your son. The one you abandoned 15 years ago. The one you claimed was dying." The effect of my words was instantaneous and dramatic. Vivian's face went sheet white. David actually stumbled backward, his drink sloshing over the rim of his glass. Summer's eyes went wide with shock. "That's impossible," Vivian stammered. "He was dying. The doctor said he only had months." Ethan stepped forward, and I had never been prouder of him than I was in that moment. He stood tall and calm, his voice clear and professional, the voice of a medical student who had spent years learning how to deliver difficult information with compassion. "Hello, Vivian. Hello, David. I'm not dead, obviously. In fact, I'm quite healthy. I'm currently in my second year of medical school, studying to be a pediatrician." But how David's voice was hoarse. The medical records said terminal illness. "The medical records were fabricated," I said, coldly. "Dr. Evelyn Reed, one of the top pediatricians in the state, examined Ethan thoroughly when I took him to her right after you left. There was no terminal illness. What there was severe malnutrition and signs of prolonged neglect. You starved him, Vivian. You deliberately harmed your own child to make your abandonment seem like an act of mercy instead of the cruelty it actually was." Vivian opened her mouth to protest, but I wasn't finished. I had waited 15 years for this moment, and I wasn't going to waste it. "I sold my grandmother's pearls to pay for that first examination," I continued. "Do you remember those pearls, Vivian? The ones our grandmother left to me, the family heirloom that was supposed to be passed down through generations. I sold them to save your son's life. And it turned out all he needed was food and love. Basic necessities that you denied him." "You're lying," Vivian hissed, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him for the first time, and I saw recognition finally dawn. The shape of his face, the color of his eyes, features she had given him. He was her son, alive and healthy, and standing before her like a ghost from a past she had tried to bury. "I have all the medical records," I said calmly. "From Dr. Reed, from the nutritionist, from the child psychologist who helped Ethan recover from the emotional trauma of your neglect. I have documentation of every pound he gained, Every developmental milestone he achieved every night, terror he suffered through because his own mother had conditioned him to expect pain and deprivation. "This is ridiculous!" David finally found his voice. "Why are you bringing this up now, after all these years?" "Because I said, looking him straight in the eyes, you asked about the kid you thought was dead. You asked if I was still bitter. You implied that I should have moved on. But how could I move on when I spent the last 15 years raising the son you both threw away? When I gave up my career, my savings, my own dreams to make sure this child had everything he deserved?" Ethan spoke up again, his voice still calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I remember everything, by the way. I remember the hunger. I remember Vivian shoving me out of the room when men would come over to visit. I remember Uncle David telling me to be quiet and stay in my room when Eleanor wasn't home. I remember the night before you left when you told me you were going on a trip and that I was being left behind because I was too much trouble. I was 5 years old and you made me believe I was a burden too heavy to carry." Summer had backed away from her mother, her face a mask of horror and confusion. "Mom," she said, her voice small. "Is this true? Do I have a brother?" Vivian rounded on me, her composure finally cracking. "How dare you! You have no right to come here and destroy my life with your accusations." "Accusations." I laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Vivian. I'm simply telling the truth. But speaking of truth, there's something else David should probably know. I had saved this piece of information, this nuclear bomb that Frank Peterson had uncovered through months of painstaking investigation. I had debated whether to use it, but seeing Vivian's smug face, seeing the way she still believed she could manipulate and control the narrative, I knew it was time. "David," I said, turning to address him directly while keeping Vivian in my peripheral vision. "Do you remember when you and Vivian left? When you started your new life together in California?" David nodded warily, clearly sensing a trap, but unable to see where it was coming from. "And Summer was born about a year later, correct?" I continued. "April 2010, if Frank's records are accurate." "Who the hell is Frank?" David demanded. "Frank Peterson. The private investigator I hired to keep track of you both," I said casually. "He's been very thorough over the years. 15 years of reports, photographs, financial records, all stored safely away, including some very interesting information about Vivian's activities during the months before you two ran away together." Vivian's face had gone from white to a sickly green color. "Don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor, please don't." But I was past the point of mercy. "Don't what, Vivian?" "Don't tell David about the hotel receipts from places you visited alone. Don't mention the phone records showing calls to numbers that didn't belong to him. Don't bring up the fact that based on the timeline you were already pregnant when you and David left, which means Summer was conceived before you two officially got together." David turned to Vivian with a look of dawning horror. "No," he said. "No, Vivian, tell me she's lying." Vivian's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Tears started streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "The timing is interesting," I pressed on relentlessly. "If Summer was born in April 2010, that means conception was around July 29. But you and David didn't leave until September 2009. Which raises the question, David, are you sure Summer is actually your daughter?" "You bitch!" Vivian finally found her voice, shrieking at me across the small space between us. Several other gala attendees had noticed the commotion and were watching with undisguised interest. "You have no proof of any of this." "Actually, I do," I said calmly. "Frank was very thorough. He found the man Vivian, or rather one of the men. Should I say his name here, or would you prefer to continue this conversation somewhere more private?" David had turned to fully face Vivian now, his face a mask of betrayal and rage. I watched as 15 years of marriage, of building a life together based on lies and selfishness, crumbled before my eyes. "Is it true?" he demanded. "Tell me the truth, Vivian. Is Summer my daughter?" "I don't know," Vivian sobbed. "I don't know. Okay, there were others. I was confused. I was scared. I didn't know what I wanted." "You don't know." David's voice rose to a shout. "You don't know if the child I've been raising for 14 years, the child I've loved and provided for and called my daughter, is actually mine. And you never thought to mention this little detail." People were definitely watching now. This scene, playing out in the middle of an elegant charity gala, was probably going to be the talk of the social circuit for months. But I didn't care. Neither did Ethan, who stood beside me with his hand on my shoulder, a silent pillar of support. Summer started crying, great, heaving sobs that shook her thin shoulders. "Daddy," she said, reaching for David, but he stepped back from her, his face twisted with disgust and pain. "Don't," he said harshly. "Just don't. I need to know the truth. We're getting a paternity test. Tonight. Tomorrow. As soon as possible." "David, please," Vivian begged, trying to grab his arm, but he shook her off violently. "Get away from me," he snarled. "You destroyed everything. You destroyed my first marriage. You destroyed Eleanor's trust. You abandoned and nearly killed your own son, and now I find out you might have been lying to me about my daughter for 14 years. What kind of monster are you?" Ethan chose that moment to speak again, his voice cutting through Vivian's sobs and David's anger like a surgical scalpel. For what it's worth, I remember the men. I remember at least 3 different men coming to visit when David was at work and Eleanor wasn't home. I remember Vivian telling me to call them uncle and not to mention them to anyone. I was young, but I wasn't stupid. Vivian's legs seemed to give out and she sank to the floor in a puddle of expensive fabric and shattered dignity. Everything she had built, the wealthy lifestyle, the respectable image, the picture-perfect family, was disintegrating around her. I looked down at her without pity. "You should have been a better person," I said quietly. "You should have loved your son. You should have been honest with David. You should have built your life on something other than lies and betrayal. But you didn't, and now you're reaping what you sowed." I turned to David, who was standing rigid with shock and anger. "I don't feel sorry for you," I told him honestly. "You made your choices. You destroyed our marriage. You participated in abandoning an innocent child, but I will tell you this, that child you left behind, the one you thought would be dead within months, is worth 100 of either of you. He's brilliant, compassionate, dedicated to helping others. He's going to be an amazing doctor, and you have no right to claim any credit for who he became." David looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and I saw something that might have been regret flicker across his face. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. "For what it's worth. I'm sorry for what we did to you." Ethan regarded him coolly. "Your apology means nothing to me. You're a stranger. Eleanor, the woman you betrayed and abandoned with your responsibilities, she's my mother. She's the only parent I've ever known. Whatever relationship we might have had died 15 years ago when you chose to leave." I took Ethan's arm, and together we turned to walk away. Before we left, I looked back at the wreckage we were leaving behind. Vivian was still on the floor, sobbing. David was standing frozen, his world shattered. Summer was crying, her perfect life revealed as a lie. Other guests were whispering phones were out, and I knew this scandal would spread through their social circles like wildfire. Good. Over the following weeks, the fallout was spectacular. Frank kept me updated, and I won't lie. I followed the developments with a sense of satisfaction I'm not entirely proud of, but couldn't deny. David filed for divorce immediately. The paternity test confirmed what we had all suspected Summer was not his biological daughter. The revelation sent shockwaves through their social circle. David's lawyers were ruthless, and because Vivian had lied about paternity and committed fraud during their marriage, she ended up with very little in the divorce settlement. The man who was Summer's biological father turned out to be a married executive Vivian had been having an affair with. When his wife found out about the child, she immediately filed for divorce as well. He wanted nothing to do with Summer and Vivian, now disgraced and nearly penniless after the legal battles struggled to provide for her. David moved to New York for a fresh start, cutting all ties with his former life. Vivian had to sell the mansion, move to a small apartment, and take whatever work she could find. Her wealthy friends abandoned her. Her reputation was destroyed. The woman who had once mocked me for living in a small house was now barely scraping by. Meanwhile, Ethan and I continued to thrive. He graduated from medical school with honors and was accepted into one of the most competitive pediatric residency programs in the country. He met a wonderful woman, Anna, who was studying to be a teacher, and they fell in love with the kind of sweet, genuine affection that reminded me of what real love should look like. 3 years after the confrontation at the gala, Ethan and Anna got married. It was a beautiful ceremony in a garden venue surrounded by friends and family who truly cared about them. As I watched Ethan exchange vows with his bride, I couldn't help but think about how different this moment was from the dark day when I first found him trembling on my staircase clutching that letter. He had asked me to walk him down the aisle since I was the parent who had raised him. "Mom," he said when he asked, "you gave me everything. You gave me life, love, opportunity. Everything that I am is because of you. I want you to be the one to give me away." I cried, of course. Tears of joy, pride, and perhaps a little bit of vindication. At the reception during his speech, Ethan spoke about his journey. He didn't hide his past. He talked openly about being abandoned, about the neglect he had suffered, and about the woman who had saved him. "My biological mother gave birth to me," he said, his voice clear and strong, "but Eleanor Vance gave me life. She showed me what it means to be loved unconditionally. She taught me that family is about who shows up, who stays, who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself. Because of her, I'm standing here today healthy, happy, and about to start a new chapter with the woman I love. Mom." He turned to look at me, raising his glass. "I owe you everything. Thank you for never giving up on me." The room erupted in applause, and I saw more than a few people wiping away tears. Anna's parents came up to me afterward and told me how lucky their daughter was to be marrying into such a loving family. A year later, Ethan and Anna had their first child, a beautiful baby girl they named Eleanor after me. When Ethan placed my granddaughter in my arms for the first time, I felt a sense of completeness I had never expected to experience. This tiny, perfect being was the culmination of 15 years of love, sacrifice, and determination. She was proof that good could triumph over evil, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Ethan established his own practice specializing in pediatrics for at-risk children, those from neglectful homes, foster care, and low-income families. He partnered with social services to identify children who needed medical care but whose families couldn't afford it. He also started a foundation, the Eleanor Vance Foundation for Child Welfare, which provided resources, medical care, and support to families struggling to care for their children. The foundation's mission statement was simple but powerful. Every child deserves to be loved, nourished, and given the opportunity to thrive. We believe that with proper support, even the most vulnerable children can grow into healthy, successful adults. I helped run the foundation using my business experience and the connections I had made over the years. We organized fundraisers, built partnerships with hospitals and schools, and created programs that made a real difference in children's lives. It was deeply fulfilling work, turning our painful past into something that could help others. As for Vivian, I heard occasional updates. She had tried to reconnect with Ethan several times over the years, sending letters that he returned unopened. She attempted to reach out through social media, but he blocked her every time. She even showed up at his medical school graduation, but security escorted her away when Ethan made it clear she was not welcome. Summer, now in her 20s, had grown up bitter and angry, shaped by the scandal that had torn apart her family. She blamed everyone but Vivian for their downfall. From what I heard, she had dropped out of college, moved from job to job, and struggled with the same self-destructive patterns her mother had exhibited. 5 years after Ethan's wedding, I received a letter. It was from Vivian, forwarded through the foundation's public address. The handwriting was shaky, the paper cheap. "Dear Eleanor," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you. I know I don't deserve your time or attention, but I wanted you to know that I've spent every day of the last 20 years regretting what I did. I see now what I had and what I threw away. I see what you built with Ethan, the life he has, the man he became, and I know that should have been mine to witness. I destroyed my own life, but worse, I nearly destroyed my son's. You saved him when I failed him. I won't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that you won. Not just the confrontation, not just the revenge, but in every way that matters. You won because you were the better person, the better mother, the better human being. I hope you're proud of what you've accomplished because you should be." I read the letter once, then put it in a drawer. I felt no satisfaction from it, no sense of closure. Vivian's regret, while perhaps genuine, came 2 decades too late. It couldn't undo the damage she had caused, couldn't erase the trauma she had inflicted on an innocent child. But her letter did make me reflect on the journey I had taken. 20 years ago, I had been a woman who had lost everything, who had been betrayed by the 2 people she trusted most in the world. I had been handed a burden that was meant to break me. A child supposedly dying, a final act of cruelty from people who wanted to ensure I suffered. But I hadn't broken. I had chosen to fight. I had chosen love over bitterness, determination over despair, and in doing so, I had gained something far more valuable than what I had lost. I had gained a son, a real son who I loved with every fiber of my being. I had gained a purpose, a mission to help other children avoid the fate Ethan had barely escaped. I had gained a life filled with meaning, success, and genuine happiness. Ethan often told me that I saved his life, but the truth was he saved mine too. He gave me a reason to go on when I wanted to give up. He gave me a focus for all the anger and pain I felt. He showed me that real love, the kind of love a parent should have for a child, is about sacrifice and commitment and showing up every single day, no matter how hard it gets. On little Eleanor's 5th birthday, the same age Ethan had been when I found him on those stairs, we had a big party. The house was filled with children laughing and playing, parents chatting and enjoying themselves, and the kind of warm, chaotic energy that comes from a real celebration of life and love. Ethan found me in his kitchen taking a moment to catch my breath. He wrapped his arms around me in a tight hug. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. For what I asked, even though I knew. For everything. For choosing me. For fighting for me. For showing me what a real parent looks like. Because of you, I get to give my daughter the childhood I never had. I hugged him back, this wonderful man who had started as a frightened, starving child and had grown into someone who made the world better just by being in it. You did the hard part, I told him. You survived. You chose to heal instead of letting your past destroy you. You chose to help others instead of becoming bitter. I may have raised you, but who you became, that was all you. We went back out to the party together, to the family we had built from the ashes of betrayal and abandonment. As I watched my granddaughter blow out her candles surrounded by people who loved her, I thought about the long journey that had brought us to this moment. They had meant to punish me with their cruelty. They had meant to burden me with a dying child while they lived their perfect life. But in their selfishness and malice, they had given me the greatest gift of my life. They had given me Ethan. And while they had lost everything I had gained, a family, a purpose, and a happiness that no amount of wealth or status could buy. Their betrayal had been meant to destroy me, but instead, it had forged me into someone stronger, someone better, someone who knew the true meaning of love and family. Looking back, I wouldn't change what happened. Not the betrayal, not the pain, not the struggle. Because all of it led to this moment, to this family, to this life. And this life, built on love and determination, and the refusal to let cruelty win, was worth every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. Vivian and David had gotten exactly what they deserved, not through any action of mine, but through the natural consequences of their own choices. And Ethan and I had gotten exactly what we deserved, too, a life filled with love, purpose, and the knowledge that we had overcome something that was meant to break us. In the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all.